not talking, is she?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to webinar Option Year Funding for Program Year 2017 for the Competitive Grantees, Department of Veterans and Training Service. My name is Cindy Borden. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for NCHV, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, and we are one half of your TA team, the National Veterans Technical Assistance Center, with our partners at AHP. Today we have Brad Sickles with us from the Department of Labor, and he's going to be leading the presentation to talk about the option year funding process for HVRP grantees. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. You will not be able to ask questions during the webinar. The phone lines have been muted. There is, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a GoToWebinar toolbar, and you'll see a questions box there. Please feel free at any time to type your questions into that questions box. We will leave time at the end of the webinar to answer those questions, and any that are not answered will be collected and sent to Brad, and he'll be able to consolidate some answers to all the questions for you. You can also email any questions you have to me at cborden@nchv.org, and I will make sure that they get to Brad. With that, I am going to hand things over to Brad. Brad, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Today's presentation, as Cindy said, is on the option year award guidance for program year 2017. What you'll see in this presentation, and it's a very relatively short presentation, is that we have an application process that's been greatly streamlined, making it, I think, more reasonable, easier for us to process, as well as ensuring that we're getting quality applicants that are actually receiving awards through this process. The background we'll talk about today is really talking about the option year award guidance itself. It is currently in departmental clearance and is expected to come out on Monday. So we expect to have that Veterans Program letter on the option year guidance issued to the field sometime around the middle of next week to late next week. So just put that on your radar. What we're covering today are the elements that are in the Technical Assistance Guide part of that VPL, an attachment to it. The second thing we'll talk about is the criteria for the option year funding. There's two sets of criteria, or two different types of applications we'll talk about. The third thing we'll talk about are the roles and responsibilities. Specifically, what is VETS looking for when it's reviewing your applications? And then we'll talk a bit about timelines and due dates, and hopefully have about 30 minutes or so for question and answer period. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, the Option Year Award VPL and the accompanying Technical Assistance Guide is currently in departmental clearance. We expect to issue it next week. It does replace VPL 5-12 that was issued in February 2012. Now through this year's Option Year Award process, we're aligning all non-competitive grants reporting with that of the PY 2017 HVRP FOLA requirements. Currently, we have three types of sets of metrics out there for grants and different periods of performance. What we want to do through this Option Year Award process is, in the terms and conditions, is put every grantee on the same 12-month period of performance, have a provision in there where you're collecting follow-up employment tracking services during the grant award itself, as well as if you receive a subsequent award following up on those prior grant people. As a note here, you may request up to 3% above your current grant award for participant tracking. Again, it will be tracking participants from your current grant that you receive with the subsequent award. Critical performance indicators, they change. We're putting everybody on the same set here. There's one that's kind of off the screen here. The first one is number of enrollments, and everybody is very much familiar with that. That's been a mainstay for a very long time. The second one is the placement rate for all exiters. You notice we dropped the number of placements. That was more of an operations or a process measure, not really an outcome measure. We've added in the average hourly wage at placement for all exiters. And the very bottom one here, I don't know if it's on your screen, but it's disappeared on mine, is the placement rate for the chronically homeless. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, the expected date of the publication for the VPL is middle of next week. There's an estimated $24 million available for option year awards. Now, you probably realize that we're currently on a continuing resolution through April 28th, so we don't have a final allotment right now for HVRP. We're expecting about the same amount we've received in the past, roughly about $38 million. The $24 million available for option year awards may go up or may go down depending upon what the final amount is that Congress appropriates for us. We anticipate announcing the new 12-month awards by June 1st. That will be kind of done in conjunction with announcing the winners of the PY17 HVRP funding announcement or opportunity announcement, that new competition. For going forward, we expect to make, for option year awards, we expect to make the announcement in the end of April in following years. This is kind of an exception. We're kind of a little bit behind schedule this year. Next year, all the due dates will be pushed up a month earlier. So our goal is to get option year awards out as soon as possible for grantees to make decisions on carrying individuals over to a subsequent grant award or not. The process, as I mentioned, has been streamlined to reduce the paperwork submitted by applicants and to reduce the review and approval time as part of this process. Next slide, Cindy. Thank you. Now, the primary sources for determining eligibility for an option year award are the second quarter technical performance report and the accompanying technical performance narrative that goes with it. As you recall, you submitted these back at the end of February, I think they were due. We're currently going through refining them, and some DVETs may be working with you grantees in terms of cleaning up a few outstanding error messages that are showing on the TPRs. We expect to have all the errors resolved by the close of business this Thursday and produce a list of those grantees that are eligible based on performance and send that to the DVETs for confirmation, and they can share it with grantees as well. The due date for the option year award applications to the DVETs, your GOTR, is April 10th. And as I said before, this is an exception. Next year it will be March 10th, and that will stay that date moving forward after that. GOTRs, if they haven't done so already, should have informed you of the pending VPL and the new due date. There are two types of applications, as I mentioned before, and that's what we're going to cover next. There's one where you're eligible based on performance, and that's going to be roughly 2/3, if not more, maybe 3/4 of the 90 or so HVRP grantees that are eligible for option year awards are in that pool this year. And then the second type of application is being eligible based on special consideration. And that's a situation where you may be failing on your performance metrics, but it's due to circumstances or mitigating circumstances that are beyond the management control of you, the grantee. So if you can account for those circumstances, have an adjustment made to your grant award in terms of modifying your grant terms and conditions and your performance goals, you can actually qualify for an option year award through that process as well. The next slide, please. Here's the first application process we talked about, the largest one. It's eligible based on strictly on performance. And we redefined what a meeting overall in the aggregate is for this. If the grant met or exceeded minimum expectations on 50% or more of the applicable critical performance indicators at the time of the second quarter review of performance, and the current grant is not designated as high risk as of December 31st, and the current grant is either an initial award, which was an award made in PY 2016, or a first option year award, which would be a PY15 grant that received option year funding in PY 2016. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about meeting performance in the aggregate, PY16 grantees, when they were new, they had 3 indicators, and PY15 had 4 indicators. So when you're applying that over half rule, for a PY15 grantee to fail or not qualify, they would have to fail 3 of the 4 measures. For PY16, they would have to fail 2 of the 3 measures in the aggregate in order not to qualify based on performance. Now, the application package for those who are doing well and performance is satisfactory and they're eligible based on that consists of a letter or memorandum from the authorized representative for the grant requesting funding for another 12 months. And it should have a phrase in there like this: request is a continuation of the current program as originally approved. Now, this doesn't prohibit you from submitting an additional modification with this if you need to, expanding, let's say, a service area or whatever it might be, adding different types of services to your array for your grant. You can actually submit modifications in addition to this. They're actually considered in addition to this option year award application itself. Now, the other paperwork that's included in addition to this memorandum or letter that you're issuing to that is an updated plan goals chart. Now, in this goals chart is where you're going to reflect your the new indicators. Remember, we talked about enrollments, placement rate for chronically homeless, and average wage at placement. Those will be reflected on there. We do expect the plan numbers to be fairly consistent with what you did this year in terms of the number of enrollments. In addition to the plan goals chart, there's an application for federal assistance, SF 424, which you're very familiar with, I'm sure. A budget information for non-construction programs, which is the SF or standard form 424A. And then finally, a budget narrative including descriptions for direct costs. So that is the sum total of your application package for those based on performance. Very straightforward. We try to streamline it as much as possible. Next slide, please. The second way to qualify, let's say you don't qualify based on performance outcomes, is to ask for special consideration at being eligible for based on special circumstances. In this situation, your grant has failed to meet the minimum performance expectations, and you can document that the underperformance resulted from compelling circumstances beyond the reasonable management control of the grantee, and the current grant is not currently designated as high risk at the end of December 31st, and the current grant is either initial award or first option year award, if we had talked about that earlier. Now, it's very important that the information you provide about underperformance, the compelling circumstances, that you present a very persuasive or convincing case there and documenting as much as possible. And we'll give you some examples on the next slide here, and we'll cover those right now. Next slide, please. Sometimes poor performance can result from a number of circumstances outside your control. One could be delay in the receipt of federal funds. It could be that, let's say, by the time July 1st rolls around, we don't have an allotment from Congress yet, which means we can't actually disperse the federal funds, which would cause a delay in the program actually getting started. That would be an example. Another example of delay is it could be something administrative in nature that happens within DOL. One year we had an issue with a wrong account number. They're very long numbers, and just being off one digit or one character can make things go crazy. You can have difficulties and a resulting delay from in obtaining physical space for your grant project itself. And it could be something outside your control. It could be construction issues that are outside your control. It could be problems in getting inspections, whatever it might be, something that's causing you a delay from getting into your space when you anticipate it to. Another area that comes up quite a bit is that you may have a partner program that has suddenly withdrawn their support and is no longer providing these services that were originally agreed to as part of the grant award, which can actually cause a delay in getting someone else to provide those services. So that's another option or issue that can come up. Acts or omissions of civil authorities resulting in significant delays in obtaining needed licensing or certifications. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's to make a civil authority makes a mistake on a license or a certification or misplaces it. I mean, that could be a reason for asking for special consideration. Next slide, we have some more compelling circumstances. This is also quite a common one, natural or man-made disasters. It could be that a tornado has swept through your town and actually leveled your training site or maybe your facility. That could actually cause a significant delay in terms of rebounding and getting your program back up to speed. You could also have issues with pandemics. Let's say pandemic sweeps through there, the majority of your clientele is out sick, and the majority of your staff are out sick. That could actually cause a significant delay or interruption in the delivery of services. You can also have mass layoffs occurring in the current grant project service area. Some grantees are in kind of fairly remote areas, and it may be that you have one very large employer there, and suddenly they lay off individuals. That could cause a significant problem for you in terms of getting placements for individuals, because now your homeless veterans are now competing with displaced workers for a very small number of jobs that are likely available in the area. Labor disputes can come up. Significant delays or interruptions affecting the availability of public services. It could be a strike of some sort. I know there was a strike one time of public transportation workers that could actually affect, people getting to and from your site or to and from to work. Other unforeseen circumstances beyond the reasonable control of the grant recipient. So think quite broadly in this regard. I mean, if your grant was actually having difficulties getting up and running in a timely fashion, and it's due to circumstances beyond your control, run that by your DVET and see if that's a legitimate reason for exploring and what type of evidence you would need to document that. Next slide, Cindy. Similar to the application for those that are eligible based on performance, those who want to be considered for special consideration, the application package is very similar. The first one is a correspondence from the grant authorized representative asking for funding for another 12-month period. The correspondence shall say this is a request for special consideration to continue the current program as modified in this request, and we'll talk about that more a little bit here. The correspondence shall describe the circumstances beyond the control of the grant recipient which seriously impaired the grant's ability to perform successfully, and the correspondence must include a modification request to make appropriate adjustments to the performance goals and, if appropriate, other terms and conditions of the grant award to actually address the compelling circumstances that have caused the program not to perform as well as anticipated. So the modification request should actually address the circumstances, remedying those circumstances, correcting them. And it could be where if it's, let's say, the number of eligibles is seriously reduced, it could be a reduction in your grant award as well, in terms of not only numbers, but in terms of the total award. Next slide, please. Similarly, this application package for special consideration includes an updated plan goals chart that we had talked about earlier, application for federal assistance, the standard form S424, SF2424, budget information, non-construction programs, the SF424A, the budget narrative, including descriptions of direct costs. And if there's a modification that you need to do, you would also put that in there in more detail if you need to. Next slide, please. Now we get into what the GOTR or the DVIT is actually looking for when you submit the applications by April 10th. End of April 10th. The first is that the applicant complied with the due date for submission. You actually submitted it by the end of business or close of business on April 10th. The required correspondence and attachments or enclosures are part of the submission. That would be things like the plan goals chart, the SF 424, the 424A, budget narrative, things like that. The application transmittal correspondence was submitted by an authorized representative for the grant. It can't be for somebody who is not the signatory. It's got to be the signatory or somebody who is a designated representative, legal representative of them. And the application transmittal correspondence requests funding for another 12 months. Next slide, please. Those were the common areas. The next one is the written request says this request is a continuation of the current program as originally approved for those that are eligible based on performance, or if it's based on special consideration, this is a request for special consideration to continue the current program as modified in this request. Each request for special consideration must include a description of the compelling circumstances beyond the reasonable management control of the grantee. And again, this is where you're presenting a persuasive, a very convincing argument to the DVET GOTR. If the correspondence indicates the correspondence should indicate whether or not you're requesting additional modifications to the grant award. It's an awkward worded bullet item I need to work on. Next slide, please. For those applicants seeking approval based on their good performance, the TPR and the TPN are reviewed by the DVET GOTR to confirm the grantee is eligible for option year funding based on performance. That is, the current grant met expectations on at least 50% or more of the applicable critical performance indicators, and the current grant is not designated as high risk at the end of the second quarter, which would be December 31st. So if you're not on high risk as of December 31st, you're okay. And the current grant is either an initial award or a first option year award. Just a restatement of the criteria we talked about earlier. Next slide, please. For those considering submitting an application requesting special consideration, the DVET is reviewing the information to confirm the grant underperformance is actually resulted for compelling circumstances beyond the management control of the grantee. So this is where you're making your compelling case, a very convincing argument, and you're providing evidence of the compelling circumstance and how it impacted. And these are the criteria we talked about before that have to be met or for special consideration. The grant did not qualify based on being eligible on performance. The underperformance resulted from compelling circumstances that were beyond the management control of the grantee, and that is also addressed in a modification request as part of that application. The grant is not designated as high risk on December 31st, the end of the second quarter, and the current grant is either an initial award or first option year award. Next slide, please. Similarly, for all these, for both types of applications, there's the SF 424 application for federal assistance and the 424A. The DVET is reviewing these forms, or the GOTR is reviewing these forms to make sure there's an original signature in ink reflecting the start and end date. Start and end date would be July 1st. End date would be June 30th. The form must indicate that it's a continuation or a revision to an existing grant. And the 424 identifies the total amount of funding needed to continue operations for the new award period, not to exceed 12 months. And as mentioned before, you can actually request up to 3% more than your current award to cover the costs of doing follow-up on grant or participants leaving your program during this grant. Next slide, please. 424A should show the 4 quarters of funding. The funding on the 424A must crosswalk and equal the funds requested on the 424. It's very important that they match. All funds must be obligated on these forms by the last day of the grant award. The plan goals chart, the values entered in this form must be consistent with the plan values for the current grant award as modified in the application request accepted by the region. And what this largely means is that the enrollments must be consistent with your current grant award. Next slide, please. Recommending or not recommending approval. This is the process that the GOTR goes through internally in terms of processing the request to the RAVET for approval and also later to the grant officer for implementation. The GOTR prepares a memorandum recommending or not recommending the option year funding for the RAVET's concern. RAVET is being the regional administrator for them. The memorandum must describe the analysis completed by their region supporting the recommendation. The memorandum must be addressed to the grant officer, who is Thomas Martin, and is through Deputy Director of National Programs, Maria Temikel. Next slide, please. The regional administrator may change the GOTR's recommendation based on his or her analysis of the application. The regional administrator will forward the signed memorandum to the Office of National Programs, then upload it to the SharePoint, which is only available to Department of Labor employees. The Office of National Programs will review the option year grant application packages and make a recommendation to the grant officer for award. This is largely reviewing the special consideration application request, making sure that the conditions or compelling circumstances are actually outside the management control of the grantee. And if there are questions, it's just getting clarification from the region, who may go back to the grantee for additional information. Next slide, please. By April 10th, and this will change to March 10th next year going forward, those recipients of HVRP funds who are eligible for option year funding must electronically submit the necessary modification request described in the tag to the GOTR. Basically, you're emailing this package to the GOTR for consideration. The GOTR will forward the modification request package with his or her cover memo indicating his or her recommendation for approval, disapproval, and seeking concurrence to the regional administrator by no later than April 19th. Which will be March 19th moving forward. Again, this is kind of an internal operation. I know we have a number of vet staff who are probably on the call, and that's why I'm covering this as well. You may have missed the webinar for vet staff that was done last Friday. Next slide, please. The regional administrator reviewed the option year modification packages and indicate his or her concurrence in the transmittal memo. And again, the memo is addressed to the grant officer through Maria Temikel, Office of National Programs Deputy Director. The region will submit via SharePoint to the Office of National Programs the memo indicating concurrence or non-concurrence and accompanying paperwork by April 27th, which will be March 27th going forward in future years. And again, listed the SharePoint site here for vet staff to use when they're uploading documents. The next slide, please. And now we're ready for questions. And we got roughly 30 minutes.
Thank you, Brad. We do have a few questions that have already come in, and we'll start with those, but I encourage you to keep asking questions. We do have time for additional questions if they're out there. The first question we have is, did I hear correctly that the GOTRs will be provided a list of those eligible for option year funding? And then sort of the part two of that is, can a grantee who is on a cap still be eligible for option year funding?
Okay. Answer to the first question is yes. We're producing a list of those who are eligible. largely due to that we can make sure everybody's performance is calculated the same way, or performance is either rounded or not rounded, whatever the circumstance might be, and compared to actual goals, just making sure that we're double checking it. That will be done at the national office level, hopefully finished this week, and sent out to the regions next week just to have them verify performance and confirm that the accuracy of the information that was provided to us. The second question was, now I've forgotten what it was. Oh, it had to do with CAPS. If you're currently on a corrective action plan, yes, you can qualify for an option year award. The circumstance where you will not qualify is if that cap was elevated to high risk status because of some unresolved finding or failure or refusal, whatever the circumstance might be, while the circumstance that should have been improved or taken care of was not, and that high risk, or it was elevated to high risk. So caps, definitely you can qualify. If it's elevated to high risk and you're on high risk as of December 31st, then no, you will not qualify.
Great, thank you, Brad. The next question, and there are two related questions, are around funding levels requested. The first one is, do all of the option year funding requests need to be at the level that they were originally requested? So whether that was $200,000 for rural grants and $300,000 for urban grants.
No, it does not have to be the same amount. You can actually apply for the same amount plus 3%, but you can go lower than that, but you can go higher.
Okay, so you can apply for up to 103% of your current award level?
That is correct.
Okay, we have a question around compelling circumstances and what those might include. And this question is whether delays in hiring or staff turnover would be an example of compelling circumstances.
It really depends on the circumstances for staff turnover. If it's due to illness or something like that, possibly. If it's due to people just leaving because you're not paying a living wage or whatever circumstance it might be, that, or it's just a freak circumstance that it's just all leave, probably not. It's something that's probably within your control in terms of staffing. What was the other circumstance you had cited there, Cindy?
That was it. The question was, it was around either difficulty hiring or maintaining. So it was either hiring staff initially for a new grant or keeping staff for an existing grant.
Yeah, those are, we consider those to be circumstances typically within the control of the grantee.
Great, thank you, Brad. The next question is in regards to the description of the direct cost, and it says that the person is asking if they still have to use Appendix E, or do they now just include that direct cost piece in that budget narrative?
Are they talking about the direct cost form? Is that what Appendix E is? I don't have it in front of me. Okay. Yes, they fill out that as well as a budget narrative.
Okay. So fill out the direct cost form as well as the budget narrative piece.
Correct.
Another question that goes back to funding, given that the new competitive grants have a ceiling of $500,000, will current grantees be allowed to increase their budgets and services?
No. You're stuck with your option year award amount. So if it's 103% of what your current award is, which you can apply for.
Okay. And then a related question was, if a grantee is planning to request more than that 103%, can they use this option year process, or would they have to apply for a new award?
If they want more than 103% of the current grant award, they're going to have to apply for a new award itself.
Great. There's a question about the requirements for follow-up. You had mentioned, Brad, that 3% would be to do follow-up activities, and there's a question for more definition about what that follow-up might look like.
Oh, okay. The follow-up activities are actually tracking post-program outcomes for participants that leave the program. There are two new measures that will be introduced that haven't been used before. One is employment rate in the second quarter after exit. Next one is the employment rate in the fourth quarter after leaving the program, after exiting, and the median earnings in the second quarter after exiting the program. Those are distinctly different than what we used for WIA in the past. Remember, in the past we had the employment rate in the first quarter after exit. We had retention in the second and third quarters after exit, and then we also had the average earnings for that 6-month period at retention. So there is no retention measure anymore. Now we're looking at employment rate in the second quarter, employment rate in the fourth quarter, and the median earnings in the earnings actually reported in the second quarter after exit. So those are the things you'd be tracking in terms of administratively.
Okay, thank you, Brad. The next question is, again, around a budget question, and in this case, this particular grantee was approved for a budget amendment in year 1. So their question is, do they present the budget according to the original application or to the amended application budget?
It would be the amended one. That would be the current one in effect there. That's what I'm assuming. The amended budget would be the one that's currently in effect, correct? I guess that's what I'm assuming here.
So whatever one is currently in effect is the one that they would be using?
Yes.
Okay. We have another question, just to clarify that option year funding, is option year funding available for folks who would be entering their 3rd year?
No, it's not. The 3rd year option year eligibility ended with the PY13 grantees. After that, it went to 2 option years instead of 3 option years.
So anyone who was first awarded their grant in PY14 would need to apply under the FOA for new funding?
Correct.
Great. Another question about that additional 3%. So hypothetically, if someone has a $300,000 grant, currently they could apply for $309,000 in their option year funding.
That is correct. Good math.
Okay. Good math. Okay. I win the math prize today. I do have just a logistical question, which is for me about webinar slides and recordings. The slides and the recording will be available within 24 hours. Folks who are on the webinar will receive an email with the recording. The slides will also be posted on nchv.org and nvtac.org within the next 24 to 36 hours. So look for those. A question, this is a sort of procedural question. In the letter that outlines the modification of the original application, does the 3% count as a modification that would have to be included in that letter, or is that just something that can be asked for in the budget without?
It can just be asked for in the budget. It's not a modification. It's automatically included. Yeah.
Okay. So not a modification for that 3%. Just including it in the budget narrative.
Well, let me just back up for a second. Well, the option year package itself is a modification. So when you request the 3% above it, we're saying you can do that.
Okay. But in the memo that goes with that opening letter would not have to say we're requesting a modification. It would just say we're requesting continuing grants, and then the budget would have that extra 3% included?
Yes, that's fine. But if they're including other modifications, they would need to address that in the correspondence.
Okay, great. Let's see. The February 29th, 17 tag indicates a program narrative is required if program changes are requested. Is this in addition to the transmittal letter requesting special consideration?
It could be. The program narrative would be part of it if it's a modification to the grant award to try and account for the compelling circumstances that are causing the poor performance. So it could be a change to, like you said, the actual narrative itself.
Okay, great. Another sort of procedural process question is someone's asking where they can get the 424 and the 424A forms.
You can get those off of Grant. It's www.grant.gov. The forms are listed there. They will also go out as attachments and have links to the forms to grants.gov for you to download as well.
Great, thank you. If option year funding is being aligned with the PY 2017 FOA, are grantees being held to the cost per placement or cost per enrollment, which is a change in 2017?
There is no cost per placement indicator, a critical indicator. We're still tracking cost per placement as an advisory measure. So in terms of a critical indicator, it is not a critical indicator in PY17 moving forward.
Okay. If you change any of your critical goals, do you have to change your funding request?
If you change any of your critical goals, you have to change your funding request. I'm not sure of the context for this one. Can you help me out? Is there any more?
There's not, but I think, Brad, what my suggestion might be is that this is a good time to remind folks that if you're applying for special consideration, you should be in very close contact with your GOTR, with your GVET, and that some of these kinds of questions are things that your GOTR or your GVET would be able to answer and help them with.
Thank you.
There's another question which I think is also, again, perhaps a GOTR GVET question, which is about administration, the percentage of costs that can be, of your overall budget that can be for administrative costs.
Oh my gosh, it's actually, was it addressed in a grant officer's memorandum recently, I believe. I'd have to check on it. I know it's also, I'm trying to think, I don't remember if it was part of the FOA or not. I know you can use either the higher of either the indirect cost rate if you have one, or 20% was what we were looking at one point in time. I'll have to double check on that one just to confirm it, that it was actually included. But again, that was what I remember. It may not be correct. So with that little caveat
there. So more to
there.
come on that one as well, and perhaps another thing to follow up with the DVET and the GOTR as well.
Sure.
Let's see. A question about if someone is applying for a new grant under the FOA, are they still eligible for option year funding for their current grant?
I'm trying to remember what the FOA said on this one. I'll have to refer to it. It allows you, I mean, you can apply for both, but you're going to get one or the other. I mean, it's not where you're getting both.
Unless, Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's a different service area or
unless it's a entirely different application. Correct. If it's an entirely different type of service strategy, different type of population you're serving, different outcomes you're anticipating, yes.
So you depending on, as long as you're proposing either a new service area or a new service population, you could potentially be eligible for both your option year and then a new grant as well.
Right. So, for example, if you currently have just the typical HVRP grant and you wanted to apply for an IVT grant where you just wanted to serve solely incarcerated veterans in that service area, you could do that. So you could have 2 grant awards.
Great, thank you. Well, applying for a new grant to increase services in funding, this one I'm going to have to get back. I'm not quite sure what they're asking, so I'm going to get some clarification and come back to that. For folks who are requesting a continuing grant under special circumstances, can the updated critical performance measures be the same as the initial ones that were supplied?
Okay, you're saying that they don't need a change to the critical performance indicators, but there's compelling circumstances that cause underperformance?
Yeah, I think they're saying if they're asking for to be considered under special circumstances, do they have to change their critical performance measures in that request, or can they keep those measures the same and still explain the circumstances?
So they're anticipating they can actually recover from the circumstance.
Yeah, that's what it
yes,
like.
that's quite possible. Yeah, that could definitely happen.
Okay, great.
Good questions, guys.
So here's someone who's just sort of making sure the following things are no longer required in the renewal package. It says direct cost description, which I think actually is required through the 424 and the budget narrative, correct?
That is correct. That is still required.
So that one is still required. Certifications and an assurance of signature page, is that no longer required?
It's not required. That's correct. That I mean, when the grant award is actually executed, you'll be signing things like that.
And they would not have to include copies of their TPR and TPN with their
That is correct.
award. Great.
Yeah, we're using what was submitted. That is correct. We're using what was submitted back in late February.
Okay, great. Another follow-up question around follow-up and what that funding, that 3%, can be used for. And the question is whether that funding is restricted to staffing follow-up services or follow-up services for clients, or what restrictions are there on that follow-up, what that follow-up funding can be used for?
Yeah, it's primarily limited for follow-up tracking only. It's not providing participant services.
Okay, for tracking purposes. There's a question about drafting plan goals for option years. Again, this may be a question that is better geared towards, directed towards DVETs and GOTers, but a question about whether plan goals for option years can be increased or decreased.
Yes, you can. It might have to be negotiated, like you said, with the GOTer.
There's a question that says, we would be entering year 3 on July 1st. Does that make us eligible for option year funding?
This would be their third year, you're saying?
Yes, third year.
No, they would not be eligible.
Third year would be starting on July 1st.
No, it's only those that are in the initial year or their first option year.
So in other words, Brad, anyone who was awarded in, first awarded for program year 15 or after?
Yes, those who were awarded in 15, initially awarded in 15 and 16 are eligible. Those awarded in PY 14 and earlier are not eligible for an option year award, and they can apply for a new award, though.
Okay. So here's a question, again, probably for GOTers and DVETs about budget modifications other than that 3% increase. If there's just shifting between line items, would that be considered a mod to be mentioned in the transmittal memo, or would that just be included in the budget itself?
It's just included in the budget itself. Okay. You're submitting a new budget and a budget narrative and the direct cost descriptions.
Okay. There's a question about in an option year, can they change the quarterly performance totals as long as they keep the overall totals for the year the same? And I think you've answered that they wouldn't have to necessarily keep those overall goals for the same for an option year, correct?
Correct, but I mean, we're not looking for significant swings either at the same time. So some of these measures are brand new. We don't have any baseline data necessarily for you, for your grant to work from. So like the placement rate for chronically homeless is a brand new one. You probably haven't been tracking in the past. The average hourly wage of placement is a new one. So there's some new indicators that you may not have any data for your program to actually make a good guess in terms of what outcomes should be. For those that you do know, things like the placement rate, you should have something similar to what you've proposed in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad. There's another question about, will there be guidance from vets, from national office or from vets on how to calculate median earnings?
How to calculate? The TPR is actually set up to calculate the median earnings. If you took all of your clients and ordered them from highest to lowest in terms of their earnings there, the median would be the actual center value, the middle value there. So that's how you would calculate the median earnings. And there's actually a formula you can use in Excel to do something like that. It's quite easy to do.
Great, thank you, Brad. We have another question, which is about the difference, because we've been using these terms somewhat interchangeably, the difference between a DVET and a GOATer.
Well, I use them interchangeably because DVETs are typically the GOATers, and there could be other individuals in the regional office that are designated GOATers, but typically it's also the DVET. So that's why I said DVET GOATer.
So the DVET is your state director, and then the GOATer is the grant officer technical representative. And in many states, the DVET is the GOATer, but there are some states, certainly larger states, where assistant directors serve as GOATers as well.
Correct. Very good.
I'm learning a few things, Brad. I'm picking up some stuff. There is a question from someone who wants to know if they can confirm or find out before next week if they're eligible to compete for option year funding because of the impending due date of the FOA at the end of this month, the FOA deadline being March 31st. I think someone is trying to decide if they would apply for a new grant if they weren't eligible for option year funding.
Sure. If they go to their last TPR, and assuming that they don't have any errors in terms of data entry, there'll be a stoplight on there for the critical indicators. So if you're a PY15 grant that received PY16 option year funding, you'll have 4 critical indicators that will have stoplights there. If you're a PY16, it will have 3 critical indicators at the top. And you should know what those critical indicators are. The stoplight on there will be either a red, yellow, or green. Green means that they met or exceeded their expectation, were actually above their goal. A yellow means that they were within 85% to 100% of the goal, and a red means that the performance was below 85% of the goal. So they can actually go to their TPR and see that information.
Great, thank you, Brad. We wanted to hear, we had someone who just wanted a little bit more clarification about caps and the impact of a cap on someone's eligibility to apply for option year funding.
Again, a cap does not prohibit you from applying for option year funding. The only exception to that rule is if the cap was elevated to high-risk status and you were on high-risk status on December 31st. That would disqualify you from option year funding.
Great, thank you. And again, just to clarify for folks, if you were first awarded your grant in program year 15, so that your grant first started July 1st of 2015, then you are eligible for an option year grant, assuming you meet the requirements outlined.
Correct.
And if,
correct.
Or if your grant first started on July 1st of 2016. If your grant first started on July 1st of 2014, you would not be eligible for option year funding.
That is correct.
There's a question here about carryovers from current grants and if they would be considered new enrollees under the option year.
This is a reporting question, but yes, you can have carryover grantees. You're talking about carryover from this grant to the subsequent grant award, the option year award, I'm assuming. If that's the case, yes, you can have carryovers. And the way you reflected it on your TPR is that you have the individual's record on there where you're recording the information, characteristics, the services they received, the quarters and all that neat stuff. But you don't have an exit in there. You don't have an exit quarter. You would use the same identifier that you use in the current TPR and place it in the new TPR and identify them as being a carryover participant in the new grant award.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm trying to get a couple of other questions in here. If you do not qualify for option year funding, yes, you can submit an application for a new grant award under the FOA. A little bit of clarification about the red lights. So if someone has a red light, should they apply or not apply, or is it more about the number of red lights and whether they are automatically eligible or need to go for special consideration?
Yeah, it's actually looking at the performance in the aggregate and not looking at an individual indicator per se. So, for example, in PY15, you've got 4 critical indicators. If you have a green or a yellow light, well, but you have 4 indicators. In order for you not to qualify for PY15 grant, initial grant, you'd have to have a red light on 3 of the 4 indicators. So if you have a red light on 2 indicators, you qualify.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So you're looking at performance in the aggregate. So failure is defined in the aggregate as failing more than half of your indicators. Okay,
and more than half would vary depending on whether you're a PY15 grantee or a PY16 grantee.
Correct. 15 has 4 indicators, so failing over half would be failing 3 of the 4. For PY16, 3 indicators, then they would have to fail 2 of the 3 in order to consider failure.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Just trying to, since we're at 3 o'clock, just trying to see if there's any other questions I can answer quickly. I will remind folks, too, I'm going to keep this, the webinar open, not the phone line, but the webinar itself for a few minutes, so that you can send in additional questions, and we'll make sure that those get to Brad. You can also send them directly to me through my email address, cborden@nchb.org, and I will make sure I send those, sort of collect all of those together and send those over to Brad as well. We had one more question about forms. Again, in this case, it was finding the updated goals chart, and I'm guessing, Brad, that will be sent along with the VPL and the other updated forms as well?
That is correct.
I think we are at 3:01, so we're just a little bit over time. So I think I've gotten through most of the questions here. We are gonna, as I said, I'm gonna collect all of the questions, send them all to Brad to make sure that everybody gets an answer to the questions that they've had. If any come up, please feel free to email me directly, and we'll make sure that Brad gets those so he can send an answer to you. Brad, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And again, just
Thank you very
so
much.
everyone knows, we did record the webinar, so the webinar recording and a copy of the slides will be available on both the nvtac.org website and NCHV's website, probably within the next 24 to 36 hours. So please look for that. You will also get a follow-up email through the GoToWebinar system, and that email will have a link to the webinar recording. It will not have the slides, but it will have the recording, so that'll be another way for you to get that. So thank you all very much. And Brad, thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.